Yes, I did need
There
a
was
break.
also a special type of grenade called the
Let's.
Tactical Zone
Oh,
forming
stop.
up area and rear combat zone.
Stop,
27
stop.
kilometers range, heavy anti-tank guns and mortars. Tactical forward combat zone.
So let's read from the top.
Sticky bomb in production effectiveness. Some grenades were designed so that they adhered to the tank either through an adhesive, sticky bomb, or with a magnet. The Germans used a magnetic grenade. The Haftholadung to ensure that the shaped charge would fire at the optimal 90 degrees angle to armor. There was also a special type of grenade called the Nebelham-Granaten or Blenkerper, smoke hand grenades, which was supposed to be smashed over an air vent and fill the tank with smoke, widely used by both sides in World War II. Molotov cocktails also saw much use, especially in the Winter War, Allied tanks, such as the T-26, being very vulnerable to them. But later tanks required a well-thrown bottle directly over the engine compartment to have any effect at all. On the whole, thrown anti-tank weapons suffered from a variety of drawbacks. In addition to the inherently short range, they required careful aim to be effective, and those that relied on explosive force were often so powerful that the user had to take cover immediately. Additionally, with hand-thrown grenades, the requirement for the attacker to get close to the tank made the attacker exceptionally vulnerable to counter-attack from the tank, typically by machine gun, or from infantry-mounted or dismounted troops accompanying the tank. However, if the attacker were very low to the ground, and in very close proximity to the tank, for instance 30 feet, 9.1 meters, or less, it might be impossible for the tank crew to see the attacker. 14. Tactics. A Finnish soldier with a Molotov cocktail in the 1939-40 Winter War. Anti-tank tactics developed rapidly during the war, but along different paths in different armies based on the threats they faced and the technologies they were able to produce. Very little development took place in UK because weapons available in 1940 were judged adequate for engaging Italian and German tanks during most of the North African campaign. Its experience therefore failed to influence the U.S. Army's anti-tank doctrine prior to 1944. From 1941, German anti-tank tactics developed rapidly as a result of being surprised by the previously unknown Soviet tank designs, forcing introduction of new technologies and new tactics. The Red Army was also faced with a new challenge in anti-tank warfare after losing most of its tank fleet and a considerable part of its anti-tank capable cannons. Anti-tank tactics during the war were largely integrated with the offensive or defensive posture of the troops being supported, usually infantry. Most anti-tank tactics depend on the range effectiveness of various weapons and weapon systems available. These are divided as follows: operational range over the horizon, 20-40 kilometers range, bomber aircraft and long-range artillery. Tactical staging areas, 7-20 kilometers range, ground attack aircraft and field artillery including MRLs. Tactical zone forming up area and rear combat zone, 2-7 kilometers range, heavy anti-tank guns and mortars. Tactical forward combat zone, 1-2 kilometers range, anti-tank guns and tanks deployed in defense. Engagement distance, 200-1000 m range, mines and anti-tank rifles. Close combat distance, 25-200 m range, infantry anti-tank weapons. Ground-to-air cooperation was not yet systematic in any army of the period, but given sufficient warning, ground attack aircraft could support ground troops even during an enemy attack in an attempt to interdict the enemy units before they come into tactical combat zone. Various bomb loads can be used depending on what type of tank unit is engaged in at the time or who its accompanying troops are. This is an indirect form of anti-tank warfare where the tanks are denied the opportunity to even reach combat. Field artillery was particularly effective in firing against tank formations because although they were rarely able to destroy a tank by direct penetration, they would severely crater the area, preventing the tanks from moving, therefore causing them to become nearly stationary targets for the ground attack aircraft, or disrupting the enemy schedule and allowing own troops more time to prepare their defense. Examples of Czech Hedgehogs deployed on the Atlantic Wall in the vicinity of Calais. Anti-tank defense proper was by 1942 designed in First World War fashion with several prepared trench lines incorporating anti-tank weapons of different abilities. Depending on terrain and the available line of sight, the longer-ranged guns could begin to fire on approaching tanks from as far as 2 kilometers. Which was also the range at which German Panther and Tiger tank gunners were retrained to fire. Anti-tank guns were usually deployed to cover terrain more suitable for tanks, and were protected by minefields laid at about 500 meters to 1 kilometer from their positions by combat engineers. In the Red Army, the anti-tank rifle units would position throughout the forward trench line and would engage with lighter tanks and any other vehicles, such as infantry half-tracks, in an attempt to separate them from the tanks. The anti-tank guns deployed further back would often hold their fire until enemy tanks were within the most effective range for the ammunition. Where there were insufficient anti-tank weapons, engineers would construct anti-tank obstacles such as Dragon's Teeth or Czech Hedgehog. Towed anti-tank guns were thought to be the primary means of defeating tanks. At the Battle of Kursk, for example, the Red Army deployed more artillery regiments than infantry regiments, and towed gun densities reached over 20 guns per kilometer of defended tactical zone. A towed gun was much cheaper than a tank and could be concealed in a shallow position. When time allowed, dugouts with strong overhead cover could be constructed. Guns deployed on reverse slopes and in flanking positions could take a toll of attacking tanks. However, gun crews were vulnerable to artillery, mortar fire and enemy infantry. The positions had to be carefully selected, and once engaged, they generally could not redeploy. Experience strongly suggested that towed guns were less effective than self-propelled weapons and took heavier casualties. The tactic of ambushing enemy armor at grazing shot distances was perfected during World War II. Some combatants, like the Soviet Red Army, doctrinalized it and used it to engage heavy German armor at optimal distances and angles. Self-propelled anti-tank guns were rare at the beginning of WW2, although the Belgian army deployed a few T-15 tank destroyers and the French army was developing several wheeled and tracked designs. The advantages of mobility and even thin armor protection were so compelling that most armies were using self-propelled guns by mid-war. Examples of these weapons included the US M10, German Jagdpanzer IV and Soviet Su-85. Infantry close assault. Panzerfaust armed German soldiers in the Eastern Front, 1945. The tank is still vulnerable to infantry, especially in close country or built-up areas. Rough terrain may expose the floor armor, and high ground such as multi-story buildings may expose the top armor. Their large size and loud noise can allow enemy infantry to spot, track and evade tanks until an opportunity presents itself for counter-attack. Because tank crews have limited visibility from inside the tank, infantry can get close to a tank given enough concealment and if the hatches are closed. If tank crewmen unbutton for better visibility, they become vulnerable to small arms fire, grenades and Molotov cocktails. An infantryman cannot be targeted by a tank's main gun when close, as it cannot depress sufficiently. Close defense weapons such as pistol ports, hull, coaxial and pintle-mounted machine guns gave them some protection. However, whilst many handheld infantry anti-tank weapons will not penetrate the front armor of a tank, they may penetrate the less heavily armored top, rear, and sides. Anti-tank weapons can damage the tracks or running gear to inflict a mobility kill. Early World War II tanks had open vision slits that could be fired through to harm the crew. Later tank slits had thick glass, and sights and periscopes which could still be damaged with powerful small arms such as anti-tank rifles and heavy machine guns, hampering the crew. If all else fails, the hatch could also be forced open and grenades thrown inside, although later tank designs often have hatches designed to be difficult to open from the outside. Tanks were also vulnerable to hand-placed anti-tank mines. Infantry have even immobilized tanks using a set of plates covered with leaves and dirt as dummy mines, the ruse being augmented by the crew's obscured vision. Infantry can then attack the stopped tank. This tactic was taught to the British Home Guard during World War II since they were not often provided with long-range anti-tank weapons. 15. In some cases in World War II, a tactic of some infantry was to run directly up to a tank, avoiding its main and machine guns, and pour petrol over and into the tank and light it, sometimes blocking the exit, burning the crew alive. In the Japanese army, the use of satchel charges and pole charges was widespread. Although the charge scored knock out any Allied tank, the tactic was extremely close range and the sappers were vulnerable to lead weapons. Suicide bombing. Chinese suicide bomber putting in an explosive vest made out of Model 24 hand grenades to use in an attack on Japanese tanks at the Battle of Taihuang. Chinese troops in the Second Sino-Japanese War used suicide bombing against Japanese tanks. Chinese troops strapped explosives like grenade packs or dynamite to their bodies and threw themselves under Japanese tanks to blow them up. 16. This tactic was used during the Battle of Shanghai, where a Chinese suicide bomber stopped a Japanese tank column by exploding himself beneath the lead tank. 17. And at the Battle of Taihuang, where a dynamite and grenades were strapped on by Chinese troops whooshed at Japanese tanks and blew themselves up. 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, during one incident at Taihuang, Chinese suicide bombers obliterated 4 Japanese tanks with grenade bundles. 24, 25, North Korean tanks were attacked by South Koreans with suicide tactics during the North Korean invasion of the South. 26, 27, American tanks at Seoul were attacked by North Korean suicide squads. 28, who used satchel charges. 29, a North Korean soldier who exploded an American tank with a suicide bomb named Lee Soo-bok is hailed as a hero in North Korean propaganda. 30. During the Iran-Iraq War, the Iranian Mohammed Hossein Fahmida blew himself up under an Iraqi tank with a grenade. According to the Sudanese writer Mansour al-Hajj, Sudanese jihadists were trained to attack enemy tanks by suicide bombing them. 31. Korean War. The initial assault by North Korean KPA forces during the Korean War was aided by the use of Soviet T-34-85 tanks. 32. A North Korean tank corps equipped with about 120 T-34s spearheaded the invasion. These drove against a ROK army with few anti-tank weapons adequate to deal with the Soviet T-34s. 33. The North Korean tanks had a good deal of early successes against South Korean infantry, elements of the 24th Infantry Division, and the United States built M24 Chaffee light tanks that they encountered. 34, 35. For the UN forces, aerial interdiction by ground attack aircraft was the only means of slowing the advancing North Korean armor. The tide turned in favor of the United Nations forces in August 1950 when the North Koreans suffered major tank losses during a series of battles in which the UN forces brought heavier equipment to develop an anti-tank role, including US M4A3 Sherman medium tanks backed by M26 Pershing heavy tanks, along with British Centurion, Churchill, and Cromwell tanks. 36. In the US, The 2.36-in, 60mm M9A1 bazooka rocket launcher evolved into the more powerful 3.5-in, 89mm M20 Super Bazooka, which was used to good effect against North Korean armored spearheads during the Korean War. However, the M20 proved difficult and cumbersome to portage on foot over long distances. The anti-tank aircraft rocket, developed by the Navy, also proved effective against North Korean tanks. Cold War. In the Cold War era, heat became an almost universal choice outside of artillery and tank units. The British had developed the high-explosive squash head, HESH, warhead as a weapon for attacking fortifications during the war, and found it surprisingly effective against tanks. Although these systems allowed infantry to take on even the largest tanks, and, like heat, its effectiveness was independent of range, infantry typically operated at short range. A major influence in anti-tank warfare came with the development and evolution of anti-tank guided missiles, ATGM, that could be fired by infantry operators from ground vehicles and by aircraft. Increasing use of combined arms tactics allowed the attacking infantry to suppress the anti-tank crews effectively, meaning that they could typically get off only 1 or 2 shots before being countered or forced to move. Aircraft. Fixed-wing Cold War aircraft, such as the A-10 Thunderbolt II and Su-25 Frogfoot, have been specifically built for close air support, including tank destruction. They can use a variety of weaponry, including large-caliber anti-tank autocannons or rotary autocannons, air-to-surface missiles, for example AGM-65 Maverick, volleys of unguided rockets, and various bombs, unguided or laser-guided and with or without submunitions such as HEAT bomblets, an example of which would be the CBU-100 cluster bomb. Helicopter R-64 Apache, an anti-tank helicopter with 8 AGM-114 Hellfire missiles. Guided anti-tank missiles were first used in a helicopter-borne role by the French in the late 1950s, when they mounted SS-11 wire-guided missiles on Alouette 2 helicopters. 37. Initially there were Omani teething problems, however, the possibilities, such as providing the ability to attack the more lightly armored top of the tank, were clear. Although putting weapons on helicopters, probably, dates back to 1955 with the Bell 47. The first specific attack helicopter that went into mass production was the Bell R-1 Cobra in 1966. The R-1 was equipped with tow missiles in 1973 for anti-tank ability. 38. The anti-tank helicopter armed with ATGWs, anti-tank guided weapons, or anti-tank cannons is one of the biggest threats to a modern tank. The helicopter can position itself where it is not easily seen from a tank and then attack from any quarter, exposing the weaker parts of the tank's armor. The limited visibility from a closed-down tank also makes sighting a helicopter harder. Most helicopter-launched ATGWs have sufficient range that they can under the right conditions be fired at a range too long for the tank to retaliate with its own weapons. This may change with the Israelis fielding the 105mm and 120mm Lahat missiles that can be fired from the main gun of the Merkava MBT. With both anti-tank and anti-helicopter role, it does level the playing field somewhat. The Indian Arjun tank has also been modified to fire this missile. The People's Republic of China has developed 100mm gun-launched missiles based on Russian designs such as the GP-2, based on the Russian Bastion. It has been reported to have successfully engaged aerial targets, and is an anti-tank missile. Similar missiles are available for Chinese tanks equipped with the 105mm gun. The Russians have also displayed a similar if more advanced system in the Reflex. The system involves an automatic targeting of an aerial forward/land target instigated by a laser warning system. Artillery. In the last 30 years, however, a variety of artillery projectiles have been developed specifically to attack tanks. These include laser-guided projectiles, such as the US's Copperhead Cannon Launched Guided Projectile,